The first morning always sets the tone. Eleanor knew that as she pushed open the tall glass doors of the downtown office building, clutching the strap of her plain canvas bag. The lobby gleamed with polished marble floors and bright overhead lights, a place meant to impress. For her, it only magnified how out of place she looked in her slightly wrinkled blouse and loose grey slacks that had seen better days. She paused just long enough to find her bearings when someone bumped into her shoulder. A splash of hot coffee streaked across her chest, staining the white fabric in an instant. Gasps turned into stifled laughter. The young man holding the paper cup grinned wide, his pressed blazer and shiny shoes screaming privilege. "Watch it," he said, tilting his head like she was the one at fault. Then, with a smirk loud enough for the room to hear, "Guess they let anyone in here to clean up, huh?" The words landed harder than the coffee. Around them, a few people chuckled. One woman covered her mouth, pretending to cough as she whispered something to her friend. Elena felt the sting of heat spreading across her skin, the fabric clinging uncomfortably to her. But she didn't snap back, didn't raise her voice. She simply pulled a napkin from her bag and dabbed at the stain, her eyes steady, calm, almost unreadable. The young man stood there, waiting for her to flinch, waiting for her to defend herself. When she didn't, he rolled his eyes and strutted off toward the elevator, leaving behind the faint smell of burnt coffee and arrogance. For a moment, Eleanor stood alone in the lobby, the crowd's whispers trailing like a shadow. She straightened her shoulders, tucked the napkin away, and walked forward as if nothing had happened. But the silence that followed her footsteps said everything. By the time Elena found her way to the cafeteria later that morning, the stain on her blouse had dried into an ugly brown patch. She carried a small tray with nothing more than a bottle of water and a plain apple. The room buzzed with chatter, clusters of employees gathering at their usual spots. She scanned the tables and saw one in the corner that was empty. Quiet, away from the noise, exactly what she needed. She had barely sat down when a group of marketing associates swept in, their voices bright and sharp like they were performing for an audience. One of them, a tall woman with bleached hair and a diamond bracelet that caught the light, stopped short. Her eyes narrowed at Elena sitting there. "This table's ours," she said, tapping her manicured nails on the surface. "Team lunches every day. You'll want to find somewhere else." Her friends chuckled, the kind of laugh that wasn't really about humour, but about making sure everyone in the cafeteria noticed. Elena looked at the table, then at the group in front of her. She didn't argue, she didn't beg. She simply picked up her tray, stood slowly, and said, "Then it's yours." Her voice was calm, but the way her eyes lingered on the woman's face made the laughter falter just for a beat. Eleanor walked across the room, her flats soft against the tile floor, and sat at a smaller table near the vending machines. Alone again, but steady. From the corner of the cafeteria, a few people watched the exchange in silence. One of them, a quiet young man with glasses and a faded company polo, shook his head and looked back at his food. It was a small gesture, but Elena caught it. Not everyone in this place was blind. She bit into her apple, the crunch sharp in her ears. The sting of humiliation was still there, but under it was something else, patience. The kind that doesn't snap, doesn't break, just waits. And already the waiting was starting to change the room. The afternoon dragged on, the kind of long hours that made every hallway feel heavier than it should. Eleanor carried a slim folder back toward her desk, her mind still buzzing faintly with the sting of the cafeteria incident. She told herself to let it go, but her fingers tightened around the folder just a little, as if holding something steady could keep her from shaking inside. As she turned the corner, she spotted an older janitor struggling with his cart. A mop had slipped loose, clattering against the wall, his face flushed with embarrassment as he bent to pick it up. Before he could, a floor manager stormed out of an office. "Seriously?" the man barked, his voice sharp. "This isn't a subway station. Try not to make the place look like a mess." The janitor lowered his head, fumbling with the mop handle. A couple of employees passing by smirked, eager to keep moving but not before enjoying the scene. Eleanor hesitated for a beat, her chest tightening. She knew too well what it felt like to be humiliated in front of strangers. She stepped forward, bent down and picked up the mop herself. Handing it back gently, she said, Happens to everyone. Don't worry about it. The manager's eyes narrowed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Oh, so you're his assistant now? Guess everyone finds their level sooner or later. A couple of chuckles followed. Eleanor drew in a slow breath. For a moment, her jaw clenched, but she forced herself to ease it before anyone noticed. She met the manager's stare, calm but unyielding, and after a long second, he shifted his gaze away. The janitor's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the mop, but when his eyes met Elena's, there was gratitude there, quiet, wordless. Eleanor continued down the hall, her flats tapping softly against the tile. The sting from earlier wasn't gone, but at least now it had somewhere to rest. Dignity, she reminded herself, wasn't about winning an argument. Sometimes it was just about standing still when someone expected you to shrink. And in that small, hushed moment, a few nearby heads turned, not to laugh, but to watch. The next morning, Elena arrived early, hoping the quiet would steady her before the day began. She took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee at her desk, then followed the stream of employees into a conference room for a brainstorming session. The walls buzzed faintly with the sound of laptops snapping open, chairs squeaking, and people scrolling through their phones. At the front, a manager in a tailored suit tapped a marker against the whiteboard. "We need fresh ideas," he said, already sounding impatient. "Numbers are down. Corporate wants solutions yesterday." The room fell silent. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Eleanor shifted in her seat, her folder balanced neatly on her lap. She could feel her heart beat a little faster. She told herself to stay quiet, but then, almost without thinking, she raised her hand slightly. "What if we tested a loyalty program?" she said, her voice calm but careful. "Something simple, points or small rewards for repeat customers. It could build consistency without spending too much on ads." For a moment, no one spoke. A few heads turned her way. Then someone snorted from across the table. "Sounds like a quick Google search." The words drew laughter, sharp and easy. Elena felt her face warm, her hand lowering back to her lap. She took a quiet breath, pressing her thumb into the edge of her folder to ground herself. 5 minutes later, the manager stopped pacing. "What about a loyalty program?" he announced, repeating almost word for word what Elena had suggested. "Points, perks, whatever keeps customers coming back without heavy costs." This time, heads nodded. "That's smart," someone chimed in. "Yeah, I like that." Even the man who had mocked her leaned forward, eager to agree. Eleanor kept her eyes on her notes, pen moving slowly across the page. She didn't correct them, she didn't speak. But her chest tightened as the laughter from earlier echoed in her mind, replaced now by false praise for someone else. Across the room, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes leaned back in her chair. She wasn't laughing, she was watching. The kind of watching that saw more than most people wanted to admit. Elena closed her notebook gently, steadying her breath. She told herself again what she had told herself the day before. The truth didn't need defending in the moment. It always came out in time. By lunchtime, the building was buzzing again, people rushing toward elevators in clusters, chatting about where to eat and who to impress. Eleanor carried a slim folder against her chest, walking steadily toward the polished brass elevator that led to the upper floors. She pressed the button, her reflection staring back at her in the mirrored doors. The faintest thought crossed her mind, maybe today will be quieter. The doors slid open and she stepped inside. But before they could close, a woman in a bright red blazer swept in, flanked by 2 colleagues with designer handbags and 2 loud laughter. The woman's eyes flicked to Eleanor's badge, then down to the blouse she had worked so hard to clean that morning. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice pitched high enough for people outside to hear. "This lift goes to the management floors. Interns take the one by the loading dock. Smells like garbage, but maybe that's a better fit." The 2 colleagues giggled, one angled her phone slightly, pretending to text but clearly recording. Eleanor felt the folder press harder against her ribs as she held it. For a second, her jaw tightened. She drew in a slow breath, then let it out through her nose. Without a word, she stepped back across the threshold. "I'll take the stairs," she said softly, her voice even, calm. The doors slid shut, carrying their laughter upward. In the lobby, the air seemed to shift. A few employees nearby glanced at each other, uneasy. A security guard at the desk shook his head, muttering something under his breath. Eleanor turned toward the stairwell. Each step echoed in the narrow space, her legs burning as she climbed floor after floor. She paused once, steadying herself with a hand on the railing. Her blouse stuck lightly to her back, and the folder edges dug into her palm. But she kept going. Because dignity, she reminded herself, wasn't measured by who rode the elevator. It was carried by the way you chose to walk, even if it meant taking the stairs. Later that afternoon, Elena found herself in the IT department, a quieter corner of the building where the buzz of conversations faded into the hum of machines. She needed her login reset after struggling with the system all morning. The room smelled faintly of coffee and plastic, monitors glowing with lines of code. A young technician looked up from his desk as she approached. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, his polo shirt a size too big, sleeves pushed up to his elbows. For a second, his eyes caught on the faint discoloration still clinging to her blouse, the crease in her slacks that hadn't quite ironed out. "You're the new trainee, right?" he asked. His tone wasn't mocking, it was curious, almost gentle. Elena hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I'm just having trouble logging in." She placed the slip of paper with her credentials on the counter, her voice even. But inside, her chest tightened. The elevator incident replayed in her mind like a bruise she couldn't hide. The technician didn't laugh. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small packet of wipes, sliding it across to her. "For the stain," he said quietly. "Don't let them get to you. Happens more than you'd think around here." Eleanor stared at the packet for a moment, her fingers hovering before she finally took it. A small wave of warmth broke through the ache in her chest. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying more sincerity than she'd expected. He gave a shrug, but his eyes stayed steady on hers. "People forget what it's like to be new," he added. Then, lowering his voice, he leaned in slightly. "They also forget that people are always watching." Elena slipped the wipes into her bag, her shoulders easing just a little as she turned to leave. The echo of his words followed her down the hallway, settling into her mind like a quiet anchor. For the first time in days, she didn't feel completely alone. The following day, Eleanor was asked to deliver a thick folder to a conference room on the executive floor. The receptionist handed it to her without looking twice, assuming she was just running errands. The folder was heavy, the kind of weight that carried decisions, not schedules. Across the front, stamped in bold red, were the words "Confidential Board Review." She held it carefully, her steps measured as she crossed the hallway. A group of younger employees stood nearby, leaning against the wall with paper cups and too loud laughter. One of them, a tall guy with slicked back hair, caught sight of the folder and raised an eyebrow. "Whoa, that looks important," he said, smirking. "Don't tell me they've got the coffee girl running board files now." His friend leaned closer, squinting at the cover. "Wait, does that say board review? Why would she have that?" The laughter faltered. The group exchanged quick glances, their voices dropping to hurried whispers. Elena didn't stop. She just kept walking, her heels tapping steadily against the polished floor, the folder secure in her arms. At the end of the hallway, a senior employee with silver-streaked hair and a sharp suit stepped out of an office. His eyes landed on her, then on the file in her hands. For the briefest moment, his expression shifted. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition. He gave her a small, deliberate nod before disappearing back inside. The young employees behind her fell silent. One muttered under his breath, "That's not normal." Another quickly pulled out his phone, already texting someone. Elena reached the conference room and placed the folder neatly at the head of the table. She straightened her blouse, smoothed the loose fabric at her sides, and exhaled quietly. The whispers were beginning. She could feel them spreading like ripples through the building. And for the first time since she walked through the glass doors, she didn't mind at all. That evening, the company hosted a mixer in the lobby. Small plates of food on silver trays, music drifting softly through hidden speakers. Employees clustered in circles, drinks in hand, their laughter spilling into the open space. Eleanor stood near the buffet, a glass of water in her hand, content to blend into the background. She hadn't been there long when the same young man from her first day swaggered over, a fresh glass of soda fizzing in his grip. His grin was wide, his tone mocking from the start. "Well, if it isn't the lobby star," he said, loud enough for nearby heads to turn. "Thirsty?" Before she could answer, he tilted the glass forward just enough for the dark liquid to splash across her blouse, dripping down the fabric and into her hair. The sound of laughter cut through the music, sharp and brittle. Phones came out, screens lighting up as people lifted them to record. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't wipe at the soda streaking her face. She simply set her water glass down on the table and stood there, her posture steady, her eyes locked on his. The young man chuckled at first, but it wasn't the same as before. The longer she held his gaze, unflinching and silent, the thinner his confidence became. The laughter around them wavered, some people shifting uncomfortably, others lowering their phones just a little. Across the room, an older advisor stood by a pillar, watching. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes never left Elena. She saw what others were too blind or too careless to see. Eleanor smoothed her damp sleeve with one hand, lifted her chin, and walked slowly toward the exit. Her shoes pressed soft echoes into the marble floor. She didn't rush, she didn't speak. But as the doors closed behind her, the room was no longer filled with easy laughter. Instead, a heavy silence settled, as though everyone suddenly realized they might have gone too far. The next morning, word of the mixer lingered in the air like smoke. People replayed the video clips in hushed corners, whispering about the woman who stood drenched in soda and never once flinched. Some laughed, some winced, but everyone remembered. Eleanor walked into the building as if nothing had happened. Her blouse was clean, her slacks pressed, her face calm. She carried a folder under her arm, the same kind that had caught attention earlier in the week. A few pairs of eyes followed her as she crossed the lobby, the sound of her footsteps sharper than the chatter around her. When she reached the executive floor, a set of heavy glass doors opened. The company's director stepped out, young and sharp in a suit tailored to perfection. His eyes swept the hallway, then landed on Eleanor. For a moment, the air shifted. He paused, then gave her a deliberate nod, one that didn't go unnoticed by those standing nearby. The whispers grew louder. Why would he acknowledge her? Who is she? Inside the conference room, the board was already gathered. Papers rustled, voices low, tension running through the polished mahogany table. Elena stepped forward, set her folder down at the head of the table, and stood silently, waiting. The director cleared his throat. His voice carried steady and clear, cutting through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone." He turned toward Elena. "This is Elena Martinez. Effective immediately, she is the majority shareholder of this company. She will lead the restructuring moving forward." The silence was absolute. A pen dropped to the floor and no one moved to pick it up. The same employees who had smirked and laughed at her just days ago sat frozen, their faces pale, their hands twisting nervously in their laps. From the back of the room, the older advisor who had been watching all along gave a small, satisfied smile. She had seen it coming. Elena didn't gloat, she didn't raise her voice. She simply nodded once, her eyes calm as they swept across the room. "I'm here to work," she said softly, "and I hope the rest of you are too." It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The fallout came quickly. By noon, the employees who had laughed the loudest found themselves called into HR, their names attached to incident reports pulled straight from security footage. Some left the building that very day, their desks cleared in silence. Meanwhile, those who had shown even the smallest bit of decency were noticed. The IT technician who had offered Elena wipes found an email waiting in his inbox, an invitation to join a new project team with better pay. The janitor who had been scolded in the hallway was promoted to supervisor, his years of work finally recognised in writing. The news travelled fast. By the afternoon, the building buzzed with a different kind of energy. People weren't whispering about the coffee stain or the soda anymore. They were whispering about her, about the woman who had stood there day after day and never once lost her composure. Elena walked the halls the same way she always had. Simple blouse, plain slacks, her hair pulled back. She didn't need new clothes or loud words to command respect. Her presence was enough now, Conversations softened when she passed, not out of fear, but out of something quieter. Respect that came too late for some, but just in time for others. That evening, she stood near the tall windows of the executive floor. The city stretched out below, its lights flickering on as the sun sank behind the skyline. She rested her hands on the cool railing and let the quiet settle around her. A voice broke the silence. It was the older advisor, the one who had been watching from the start. She stepped up beside Eleanor and said simply, "You didn't raise your voice once, and still they heard you louder than anyone." Eleanor smiled faintly, her reflection soft in the glass. "You don't need to shout to be heard," she said. "You just need to stand." Downstairs, the lobby was emptying out, the same marble floors that had echoed with laughter, now quiet under the weight of a different lesson. Elena didn't look back. She didn't need to. The truth had already done the work for her. True strength isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about holding your ground with dignity, treating others with respect, and letting time reveal the truth. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. I'm truly grateful for your time and support. If you enjoyed it, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. I'll see you again soon, right here on Rain Inside.